Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little colder. A time of stone walls, woolen garments, and winter winds. We're diving into how people actually survived the coldest nights in medieval castles. Forget the romantic stone chambers. Hollywood sold you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single winter night in a medieval castle without the knowledge I'm about to share. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're hearing this from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to me seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just awakened in the year 1283. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, the air in your chamber is so cold you can see your breath forming little clouds with each exhale. The stone walls that looked so grand during summer now feel like slabs of ice surrounding you. There's no central heating, no electric blanket, no thermostat to adjust. Just you, the darkness, and a bone-deep chill that makes your joints ache before you've even moved. You're in a castle, yes, but castles weren't built for comfort. They were built for defense. And right now, the only thing you need to defend against is the merciless winter night. The first thing you notice is the silence. A deep, heavy silence that seems to hang in the air like the cold itself. No humming of refrigerators or distant traffic, just the occasional creak of ancient timber beams contracting in the cold and perhaps the soft howl of wind finding its way through arrow slits and poorly fitted shutters. Even the rats seem to be huddled somewhere, conserving their energy like everything else in this frozen world. Your bed isn't what you might imagine. There's no memory foam, no springs, not even a proper mattress as you know it. You're lying on a wooden frame, possibly rope-strung if you're fortunate, supporting a sack filled with straw that rustles with every movement. The smarter castle dwellers would have this changed regularly to avoid the worst of the mold and vermin, but even fresh straw has a particular earthy smell that never quite leaves the air. If you're of higher status, you might have a feather mattress instead, but even that would be lumpy by modern standards and cold. So very cold until your body slowly warms it. Above you are layers. This is how medieval people survived. Not through warming the air, but through insulating their bodies. In a castle during winter, almost nobody sleeps alone unless they have no choice. Bodies generate heat, and shared beds were common even among servants. You might have a woolen blanket, rough against your skin but remarkably effective. Then perhaps a coverlet of heavier wool or even fur if you're wealthy enough. The truly fortunate might have a bed curtain, heavy tapestries hanging from a frame around the bed, creating a smaller space to warm with your breath and body heat. These weren't decorative, they were survival. Your night clothes aren't what you might expect either. You don't change into special clothes for sleeping. That's a luxury of later centuries. You simply remove your outer garments and loosen what remains. Your linen shirt or shift stays on, perhaps with woolen hose or socks. If the night is particularly bitter, the wealthier castle residents might have caps specifically for sleeping, keeping precious heat from escaping through the head. Some would wrap their heads in cloth, leaving just enough space to breathe. It wasn't about fashion. It was about waking up alive. The rushes on the floor that seemed so practical during summer are now another layer of insulation between you and the stone floor that radiates cold like a frozen lake. In the better chambers, these would be mixed with herbs. Partially for scent, yes, but also because some were believed to repel pests that would otherwise seek warmth in your bedding. Mint, lavender, pennyroyal, their scents barely perceptible in the cold air, but present nonetheless. In the finest chambers there might even be carpets, not on the walls as many assume, but underfoot where they serve a practical purpose beyond mere decoration. As you lie there, gathering courage to face the cold more fully, you might hear the night watch making their rounds. The soft clank of mail, the measured footsteps of men who patrol not just for enemies from without, but for the enemy all medieval people feared: fire. A castle in winter balanced constantly between the dangers of freezing and the risk of burning. Too little fire meant suffering and perhaps death from cold. Too much meant the equally terrifying prospect of being trapped in a burning stone fortress. The Night Watch carried this responsibility as they moved through the darkness, checking braziers and ensuring any fires left burning were properly contained. The heart of winter survival in a medieval castle was the fire, but not as you might imagine it. The grand fireplaces depicted in films, large enough to roast an ox and warm an entire great hall. These existed, yes, but they were remarkably inefficient. Early medieval fireplaces were often centrally located fire pits with smoke holes above, filling the room with a haze that stung the eyes but trapped heat below the high ceilings. By the 13th century, wall fireplaces with chimneys had become more common, drawing the smoke away but also much of the heat. The truly effective fireplaces with proper angled flues and heat-reflecting stone were innovations that came later. For most castle inhabitants, the fire was a communal resource. The great hall where servants slept would have the largest fire, with people arranging themselves in rough order of status, the highest ranking closest to the warmth. This wasn't just tradition, it was practical thermodynamics. The heat, only, reached so far, and sleeping near the fire could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. But even this heat faded through the night as fires burned down to embers. No one stayed up to tend them constantly except in the most extreme weather. Your own chamber, assuming you're of sufficient rank to have one, might have a brazier, a metal container for hot coals brought from the kitchen fires. These wouldn't last the night, but could take the worst edge off the cold as you settled in. The servants would have heated the bed before you retired using a warming pan, a long-handled, covered pan filled with hot coals that would be run between the sheets to drive away the worst of the damp chill. This momentary warmth was precious, and the wealthy might have their beds warmed multiple times on the coldest nights. What you don't see in your chamber are candles burning through the night. Beeswax candles were expensive. Tallow candles smoked and smelled of rendered fat. Light was a luxury used only when necessary. The darkness was nearly complete, broken perhaps by moonlight through shuttered windows or the faint glow of a dying fire. This darkness helped preserve what little heat remained, with heavy shutters closed over any windows, which might have oiled parchment or cloth rather than glass. Glass was rare and precious, and even when present, these windows didn't seal as modern ones do. The whistling of wind through cracks was a constant companion on winter nights. If nature called during the night, you faced a decision. Chamber pots were standard, kept under the bed or in a closed stool, a wooden chair with a hole and a container beneath. Using these meant exposing yourself to the cold air, however briefly. Many simply waited until morning unless the need was urgent. For those in larger castles, garderobes, castle toilets built into the walls with shafts leading to moats or cesspits below, offered slightly more comfort but required a dreaded walk through frigid corridors. These garderobes were often positioned on outer walls, using the natural drafts for ventilation, making them possibly the coldest places in the entire castle. The morning routine began before dawn in winter, not from diligence, but necessity. The short daylight hours were precious for all the tasks that required vision, and no amount of expensive candles or rushlights could truly replace sunlight. The first servants awake would rekindle fires from banked coals carefully preserved overnight. This was skilled work. If the fire went out completely, starting a new one meant using precious tinder and the labor-intensive process of striking flint and steel until a spark caught. In the worst cases, someone might need to be sent to another part of the castle or even to the village to bring back a light. Breakfast was not as we know it today. It was literally breaking the fast of night, and for many, it was a simple affair. Perhaps bread left from the previous day, softened by soaking in ale or wine if it had gone too hard. The wealthy might have something hot, a pottage of grains or perhaps preserved meats. Hot food was a defense against the cold as much as nourishment, warming from within. The heat of the kitchen was a blessed relief for those who worked there, despite the smoke and labor. Kitchen servants often slept near the great ovens, claiming spaces that were uncomfortable in summer but coveted in winter. Water was another challenge in the freezing castle. Wells might freeze, making water collection difficult. Snow could be melted, but this required fuel for heating. Water stored indoors in barrels or pitchers would develop a crust of ice that needed to be broken each morning. Washing was minimal, a quick wipe of the face and hands with a damp cloth. Full bathing was rare in winter, perhaps only for the highest nobility and certainly not daily. The lack of hot running water meant each basin of warm water represented labor. Someone carrying water, someone heating it, someone carrying it to where it was needed. Clothing was the most effective insulation against winter's bite. Unlike today's winter, where medieval cold-weather clothing worked through layers rather than through specialized garments. The base was always linen, worn against the skin regardless of season. Linen absorbs moisture, keeping sweat away from the skin where it would otherwise chill you. Over this came wool, sometimes multiple layers. Wool maintained some insulating properties even when damp, making it the perfect material for a climate as wet and cold as medieval Europe. For those who could afford it, fur provided the ultimate protection. Not as outer garments as we might expect, but as linings. Fur-lined cloaks, fur-lined gloves, fur-lined hoods. The wealthy surrounded themselves with nature's best insulation, with the fur against their bodies and fabric facing outward. The type of fur signaled status as much as it provided warmth. Common people might use rabbit or squirrel, while nobles would display the more exotic and effective furs, fox, marten, or even imported sables for royalty. Accessories were crucial. For survival, not vanity. Gloves or mittens, often of leather lined with fur or wool, protected extremities most vulnerable to frostbite. Hats and hoods were never optional in winter. The amount of heat lost through an uncovered head was well understood even without the scientific terminology. Scarves or cloths wrapped around the face protected the lungs from the shock of cold air. Wooden-soled shoes with leather uppers kept feet away from frozen ground, often stuffed with straw or wool for additional insulation. Between the inner areas of the castle and the outer walls lay an unofficial buffer zone created by the architecture itself. The design that made castles defensible. Thick walls, limited openings, and closed courtyards inadvertently created microclimates. Inner chambers were markedly warmer than outer walls. Exposure to prevailing winds could make one side of the castle significantly colder than another. The most knowledgeable castle residents understood these variations and adapted accordingly. Storerooms and living quarters were positioned with these natural temperature gradients in mind. South-facing rooms captured precious winter sunlight, while north-facing chambers might be abandoned entirely during the coldest months. Movement was medicine against the cold. No one in a medieval castle stood still in winter if they could help it. Constant activity generated body heat. Servants carried things seemingly unnecessarily between rooms. Crafts, people worked vigorously at tasks that might have been done. More methodically in warmer conditions, guards stamped their feet and swung their arms while on watch. Even the nobility found reasons to stir. Walking the interior corridors, inspecting stores, overseeing work. This wasn't merely supervision. It was survival. The cold changed social structures within the castle walls. Hierarchy remained, but proximity altered. A lord might allow his personal servants closer than protocol normally dictated, simply because body heat was too valuable to waste on formality. Communal activities increased. Needlework, food preparation, equipment repair, all tasks that could bring people together in smaller spaces. The Great Hall became greatness in function rather than just in name, hosting activities that would disperse to specialized rooms in warmer months. Food preservation was both a science and an art form in winter castles. The fall slaughter had provided meat that was now salted, smoked, or dried, hanging from ceiling beams or packed in barrels. Root vegetables were stored in cool, dry places, not difficult to find in a winter castle. Cabbages might be preserved as sauerkraut, acidic and vitamin-rich to ward off winter ailments. Fruits were dried or preserved in honey if available. Nuts provided dense nutrition and were hoarded carefully. These stores were monitored anxiously. If they ran low before spring, hunger would join cold as an enemy. Drink was more than refreshment. It was warmth and calories combined. Ale was the daily drink, consumed by all ages including children, though weaker than modern beer. It provided calories, some nutrition from the grains used in brewing, and the psychologically warming effect of alcohol. Wine was for the wealthy, sometimes mulled with expensive spices that were believed to heat the blood. Most revolutionary were the hot drinks. Herbal infusions, not quite teas as we know them, but hot water steeped with whatever local plants were believed to have beneficial properties. These provided hydration without the chilling effect of cold water, and the vessels warmed the hands of those who held them. The rhythm of the day followed the sun, but with adaptations for winter, rising before dawn, as mentioned, but also retiring early, often not long after sunset. This wasn't solely to save on lighting, it was also because beds, once warmed by body heat, were often the warmest places in the castle. Many tasks were rearranged from their summer schedules. Anything requiring fine detail or good visibility was scheduled for midday when winter light was strongest. Physically demanding tasks were preferred in early morning when the exertion would warm cold muscles. For the wealthiest castle residents, specialized equipment offered additional comfort. Foot warmers, small metal containers for hot coals, could be placed under tables during meals or meetings. Hand warmers worked on the same principle, small enough to be carried in pockets. Heated stones wrapped in cloth retained heat for hours and could be placed in beds or held against the body. Even the seating reflected winter needs. Wooden chairs with high backs blocked drafts, while stone seating, common in window embrasures, would be covered with cushions or furs to prevent the cold stone from drawing heat from the body. The animals within the castle walls adapted alongside their human counterparts. Dogs, kept for hunting and security, were also valued for their warmth. A dog at the foot of the bed was a living foot warmer. Cats earned their keep hunting vermin, but also provided comfortable warmth when they chose to share it. Even in castles where animals usually lived separately from humans, winter might see working animals brought into human spaces, partly to protect valuable livestock from the cold, but also because their body heat and the decomposition of their waste actually helped warm the spaces they occupied. The cold didn't respect rank or privilege completely. Even the lord's family faced winter challenges. The lady of the castle might find her elaborate headdress served a secondary purpose as insulation. The lord might conduct business wrapped in furs that signaled his status while serving the very practical purpose of keeping him from shivering during important discussions. Children of noble birth, despite their privileged lives, would still have chilblains on their fingers and faces chapped from cold winds. Money could buy better protection, but not immunity from winter's reality. Illness was an ever-present concern, with the cold believed to be a direct cause rather than simply the conditions that allowed disease to spread. Catching a chill was taken literally. The cold entered the body and caused imbalance in the humors, leading to sickness. Preventive measures included consuming hot broths, drinking wine with warming spices, and avoiding sudden temperature changes. The wealthy might have access to physicians who prescribed herbal remedies or even bleeding to restore proper balance. The common folk relied on folk remedies, Herbal knowledge passed through generations, and perhaps the castle's resident wise woman who combined practical nursing with elements of mysticism. Sleep patterns adapted to the season. Without artificial light to extend the day, winter brought longer nights and more time in bed. But this didn't necessarily mean more continuous sleep. Historical evidence suggests medieval people often slept in segments. A first sleep for several hours after dusk, followed by a wakeful period of an hour or two, then a second sleep until dawn. During the wakeful period, people might pray, reflect, talk quietly with bed partners, or even visit others in the castle. This biphasic sleep pattern may have been an adaptation to longer winter nights, making the darkness more manageable. The experience of cold was understood differently. Without thermometers to objectively measure temperature, cold was gauged by its effects. Water freezing, breath visible in the air, the feel of stone and metal. These were the indicators of severity. Without modern meteorology, prediction relied on observation of nature and folklore. Birds flying low, smoke clinging to the ground, unusual animal behavior. These might signal worsening weather. The ability to read these signs was valued practical knowledge, not superstition as it might seem today. Communication changed with the seasons. Winter brought isolation as roads became impassable and travel dangerous. Messages that might take days in summer could take weeks in winter if they arrived at all. Planned isolation was part of castle life. Important communications were concluded before winter if possible. Supplies were stockpiled and social obligations fulfilled. Winter was a time of turning inward, both literally into the castle walls and figuratively into smaller community circles. The contrast between day and night temperatures could be extreme. Stone that absorbed even weak winter sunlight during the day would radiate that stored heat for hours after dusk, then become an agent of cold as it finally matched the air temperature. Wise castle. Dwellers used these properties to their advantage, spending time in south-facing rooms that had been warmed by the day's sun, then moving to inner chambers as night deepened and the outer rooms surrendered their heat. Craftwork filled the winter hours, particularly after dark. Men carved wood or bone, repaired tools and equipment, or fashioned new items by firelight. Women spun wool into thread, a never-ending task that supplied the material for weaving and knitting. Both might work leather, creating or repairing shoes, harnesses, and countless other essential items. These tasks could be performed in dim light by feel as much as by sight, and the small, repetitive movements helped keep hands warm and minds occupied during the long, dark hours. The castle's own structure changed with the cold. Stone contracted, causing strange settling noises that might startle the uninitiated. Mortar between stones could crack in severe cold, requiring repairs when warmer weather returned. Wooden beams dried and shrank, sometimes creating gaps that allowed additional drafts. The castle residents became attuned to these changes, distinguishing between normal winter adjustments and concerning structural issues that might need attention when spring allowed for repairs. Water management was complex in freezing conditions. Roofs were designed to shed snow rather than bear its weight. Gutters and downspouts that channeled rainwater in warmer months could freeze solid, causing water to back up and then seep into masonry when it eventually thawed. Ice dams could form in moats, potentially compromising their defensive function. Constant vigilance was required, with servants assigned to break ice in crucial drainage channels and clear snow from vulnerable roof areas. Light became precious, beyond its practical value. The psychological effect of winter darkness was well understood, if not in modern terms of seasonal affective disorder. Feast days punctuated the winter with light and celebration. Martinmas, Christmas, Candlemas, each bringing temporary brightness and communal warmth. Between these celebrations, the simple lighting of candles or oil lamps at dusk was a small ceremony that pushed back the darkness physically and metaphorically. The sounds of winter were distinctive. The absence of many summer sounds, fewer birds, less activity outside the walls, made the castle quieter overall. But winter added its own acoustics: the creak of frozen leather, the crack of ice breaking, the sharper echoes in cold air. Wind found every gap in the structure, creating whistles and moans that gave rise to ghost stories. Footsteps on frozen ground rang differently than on summer earth. These sounds became the winter soundtrack, a background to daily life that residents barely noticed until it was mentioned by visitors. Religion provided both practical and spiritual comfort. The ritual calendar gave structure to the seemingly endless winter. Prayer offered occupation during long, dark hours and hope when physical circumstances were bleak. Religious communities attached to castles might organize charity for those suffering most from winter hardships. The church's teaching that suffering had meaning gave purpose to winter's discomforts, placing them within a comprehensible framework rather than random misery. Winter changed the defensive posture of the castle. Snow and ice could make walls, more difficult to scale but could also fill moats, potentially creating pathways for attackers. Frozen ground made undermining walls nearly impossible, providing security against one siege tactic. However, the cold reduced the endurance of guards on watch and could freeze mechanisms like portcullises and drawbridges. Military activity generally decreased in winter, but vigilance couldn't be abandoned completely. Guards rotated more frequently, serving shorter watches to prevent cold-induced inattention. The social calendar adapted to winter realities. With travel difficult, guests who arrived before winter might stay for months. Hospitality became an extended commitment rather than a brief obligation. Important tournaments, fairs, and political gatherings were scheduled for more accommodating seasons. Winter entertainments were smaller, more intimate. Storytelling rather than traveling performers, chess rather than outdoor games, music played by castle residents rather than visiting minstrels. Education continued despite the cold. Children of noble families, studying with tutors or castle chaplains, might find their lessons moved to whatever rooms were currently warmest. Writing became challenging as ink froze and fingers stiffened. Reading aloud gained prominence. One person reading near a light source while others listened and worked on tasks that didn't require detailed vision. This oral tradition reinforced community bonds while conserving precious light and fuel. Romance didn't disappear with warm weather. Winter. Marriages were sometimes preferred by the nobility for practical reasons. Food stores from autumn harvests could feed wedding guests, and agricultural work was minimal, allowing for celebration without disrupting essential labor. The close. Quarters of winter castle life might kindle relationships, though privacy was scarce. Shared warmth was a legitimate reason for physical closeness that might otherwise breach social norms. Castle staff redistributed themselves seasonally. Outdoor workers moved to indoor tasks. Grooms might assist in armories. Field laborers might help in carpentry shops. This kept valuable staff employed and within the castle community while providing extra hands for winter projects. It also concentrated human warmth in fewer spaces, an efficiency that benefited everyone regardless of status. Personal hygiene remained important despite the challenges. Even with limited bathing, people maintained cleanliness as best they could. Dry cleaning with fine powders or simply changing the linen garments worn against the skin helped manage body odors. Hair was covered not just for warmth, but also to keep it cleaner between infrequent washings. The cold itself helped with some hygiene issues. The smell of unwashed bodies was less pronounced in winter, and food spoilage slowed considerably. Boredom was an enemy nearly as formidable as cold. The enforced inactivity of winter compared to busy harvests and construction seasons left dangerous idle time. Castle leadership recognized this threat to morale and discipline. Organized activities, inventory taking, equipment repair, training for younger members of the household kept hands and minds occupied. Games were encouraged, from simple dice and board games for common folk to complex chess strategies for the educated. Music, though requiring precious light to read notation, filled evening hours with beauty and required no vision once memorized. The cold had hidden benefits rarely considered by modern perspectives. It preserved food, as mentioned, but also inhibited disease spread in some cases. Certain parasites and their vectors became dormant or died off. The hardest freezes killed pests that might otherwise consume food stores. Even human parasites like lice and fleas reduced their reproduction in cold conditions, providing some relief from their constant irritation. These benefits never outweighed winter's challenges, but they were noted and appreciated by people intimately connected to their environment. The passing of time felt different. Without precise clocks, time was marked by sunlight, activity patterns, and bodily needs. Winter days blurred together more readily than the varied days of growing seasons. This could be psychologically challenging, leading to the elaborate system of saints' days and religious observances that punctuated the calendar. Each feast or fast day created a waypoint in the winter journey, helping residents track progression toward spring's release. Knowledge transmission intensified. Winter provided the time for elders to teach younger generations, passing down practical skills, family histories, and community knowledge. This oral tradition strengthened cultural identity and ensured survival techniques weren't lost. Stories told around evening fires weren't merely entertainment. They were educational, containing embedded information about everything from weather prediction to moral guidance to practical craft techniques. The end of winter brought its own challenges. As temperatures fluctuated, freezing at night and thawing during the day, the castle environment became unpredictable. Ice melted and refroze, creating dangerous conditions on walkways and stairs. Snow, absorbing daytime sun, could melt and seep into walls, then freeze again at night, gradually damaging masonry. Stored food supplies typically ran lowest just as the first fresh growth appeared, creating a lean season before true spring abundance arrived. Throughout all these winter adaptations ran a thread of acceptance quite foreign to modern sensibilities. The cold wasn't an enemy to be defeated with technology, but a reality to be accommodated with wisdom. The discomfort wasn't seen as abnormal or avoidable, but as the natural condition of winter. This philosophical approach, working with reality rather than fighting against it, informed every survival strategy. The castle residents didn't expect to be as comfortable in winter as in summer. This acceptance itself was a survival tool, preventing the psychological drain of frustrated expectations. As you lie in your medieval bed, these realities surround you. Not dramatic hardships to overcome through heroic effort, but the daily, mundane adaptations that made survival possible. The extra layer of clothing you sleep in. The bed partner whose snoring irritates but whose body heat you welcome. The careful banking of the fire to preserve its coals till morning. The subtle positioning of your bed to avoid the worst drafts without being so far from the heat source as to lose its benefit entirely. This was winter in a medieval castle, not the romantic chill of Hollywood productions where breath is visible indoors, but characters seem unbothered by the cold. Not the acute drama of survival against a blizzard. Rather, it was the long, patient endurance of continuous discomfort, managed through accumulated wisdom, social cooperation, and the simple understanding that spring would eventually return. The cold shaped everything. Architecture, clothing, social structures, food, daily schedules, creating a winter way of life as different from summer castle life as summer was from winter. The adaptation wasn't perfect, People still suffered from chilblains, hypothermia, winter depression, vitamin deficiencies, and cold-related diseases. The old and very young still died at higher rates in winter. But the persistence of castle life through centuries of winters testifies to the effectiveness of these imperfect solutions. As you finally drift toward sleep in your historically accurate medieval bed, one final thought might cross your mind. The discomforts you're experiencing aren't failures of medieval technology or signs of primitive conditions. They're the realistic consequences of heating stone structures in cold climates using only the resources available: wood, charcoal, human ingenuity, and social cooperation. The marvel isn't that medieval people were cold in winter. It's that they survived at all, building a civilization despite the cold, not free from it. Sleep now comes easier, not because the chamber has grown warmer, but because you've adapted, mentally and physically, to its reality. The weight of the coverings that felt restrictive now feels sheltering. The darkness that seemed oppressive now feels like privacy. The quiet, broken only by the settling of ancient timbers, becomes a lullaby of sorts. This was the final medieval winter survival skill: finding comfort within discomfort, security within challenge, and rest despite it all. And so another winter night passes in the castle. One of thousands that came before, one of thousands that would come after. Each one survived not through dramatic intervention, but through simple persistence. Each one adding to the collected wisdom that would, generation by generation, improve the human relationship with winter cold. Each one demonstrating that basic human needs for warmth, for community, for purpose remain constant across centuries, while the means of meeting those needs evolve with each passing year. As light gradually returns to your chamber and morning activities begin around you, remember that you've just experienced what millions before you experienced without remarking upon it. Not an adventure, not a crisis, just a winter night in a medieval castle. Ordinary, challenging, and ultimately survivable through the accumulated wisdom of countless predecessors who also woke to see another dawn, slightly warmer than the night before, but still firmly in winter's grasp until spring finally arrived to release them from the cold's long embrace. The great hall of a medieval castle transforms completely during winter. Summer's airy, open space becomes winter's crowded center of life. Trestle tables that might be spaced widely in warmer months now crowd closer to the central fire pit or large fireplace. Benches are packed with bodies, not for lack of space, but for shared warmth. The walls, bare stone in summer, now display tapestries, not merely for decoration or to display wealth, but as insulation. These heavy woven scenes of hunts or biblical stories trap pockets of air between wall and fabric, creating a buffer against the cold radiating from the stone. The floors, typically rushes mixed with herbs in summer, are layered thicker in winter, sometimes with additional straw underneath to create insulation from the cold stone or packed earth below. The smell of the great hall in winter is distinctive. A complex mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, damp wool, and whatever might be cooking in the distant kitchen. The smoke doesn't all find its way up the chimney or through the central smoke hole. Much of it lingers, creating a perpetual haze that stings the eyes but traps heat below the high ceilings. Those unaccustomed to it might cough or complain, but the regular inhabitants barely notice. Their bodies adapted to this winter atmosphere as surely as their clothing is adapted to the cold. The kitchens remain the warmest place in the castle, with ovens and hearth fires burning almost constantly. Kitchen staff work in conditions that seem contradictory, hands moving from nearly scalding water to freezing ingredients and back again. Their skills include knowing how to keep dough from freezing before it can be formed and baked, how to judge cooking times when ingredients start at much lower temperatures than in summer, and how to manage flavorings when winter-dulled palates need stronger tastes to register satisfaction. They work with root vegetables that have been stored since fall, turnips, parsnips, onions, and perhaps cabbages, kept in barrels of sand or sawdust to prevent freezing and delay rotting. The buttery and pantry take on increased importance in winter. These storage areas, overseen by trusted servants with individual keys, hold the provisions that will sustain the castle until spring brings fresh options. The buttery, despite its name, stored drink rather than butter, barrels of ale, wine, and perhaps cider. The pantry held bread and other foods. Managing these stores required more than just honesty. It required skill in predicting consumption, rates, detecting spoilage before it spread, and making difficult decisions about rationing if supplies ran lower than expected. The servants in charge of these areas carried responsibility for everyone's survival, a pressure that sometimes showed in their thin-lipped concern as they inspected and inventoried their domains. The solar, a private family room for the lords. Family would be one of the few spaces in the castle that approached modern concepts of comfort during winter. Located usually on an upper floor to capture rising heat from below, with walls often plastered or lined with wood rather than bare stone, and sized to be heated effectively by a single fire, this room was where the castle's highest-ranking residents could find respite from winter's worst effects. The lady of the castle might relocate her loom here during winter months, the repetitive motion of weaving generating additional body heat while creating textiles that would themselves provide warmth. The family might gather here in the evenings, the rare luxury of relative privacy made possible by the cold that kept others huddled in the great hall below. The chapel, present in most castles of significant size, offered spiritual comfort but little physical warmth. Stone floors and walls, often with decorative but drafty windows, made these spaces among the coldest in the castle. Yet services continued through winter, with breath visible during prayers and fingers stiffening around prayer books. Devotion provided its own warmth of sorts, and the gathering of bodies for Mass created temporary pockets of more comfortable temperature. Castle chaplains might shorten winter services somewhat, balancing spiritual needs against physical comfort without explicitly acknowledging the compromise. For those lucky enough to have glass in their window openings, winter revealed both the material's value and its limitations. Medieval glass was thick, uneven, and often tinted green or amber from iron impurities in the sand used to make it. It provided a barrier against wind and weather without completely blocking light, but it remained cold to the touch and conducted heat outward. Those who could afford glass rarely had it in all windows. Only in the most important rooms where the display of wealth balanced the practical limitations. The rest made do with oiled parchment stretched across wooden frames, cloth coverings, or wooden shutters that blocked both cold and light when closed. The minstrel's gallery, if the castle boasted such a luxury, took on different acoustics in winter. The colder, denser air carried sound differently, sometimes with greater clarity as background noises of summer. Birds, insects, outdoor activities faded away. Music itself became more important as a winter pastime, filling empty hours and lifting spirits. Those with musical skill found themselves in demand during the long evenings, regardless of their formal role in the household. A castle guardsman who could play the flute well might find himself temporarily elevated in status during winter gatherings, his practical value augmented by his ability to provide entertainment. The wardrobe chamber, a room for storing clothing, rather than a piece of furniture, became critically important in winter. Here hung the heavy woolen surcoats, fur-lined cloaks, and extra layers that made outdoor movement possible during the coldest days. The servants responsible for clothing not only maintained these garments but also strategically moved them around the castle to balance use and airing. Wool worn too long against the body would felt and lose its insulating properties. Furs needed occasional exposure to dry cold to discourage parasites without freezing the leather backing. Rotating garments required planning and memory, qualities valued in the wardrobe keepers who managed this essential resource. The armory and equipment storage areas faced their own winter challenges. Metal weapons and armor became dangerously cold to touch with bare skin, which could freeze to the surface instantly in the coldest conditions. Leather components stiffened and required careful warming before use to prevent cracking. Bowstrings absorbed moisture from the air and needed regular replacement to maintain tension. The castle's men-at-arms and knights practiced less frequently outdoors, but maintained readiness through indoor training that focused on strength and close combat techniques that could be performed in limited space. The rhythmic sound of such practice, wooden practice swords against shields, grunts of exertion, instructional calls, provided another layer to the castle's winter soundscape. The still room, where the lady of the castle and her female attendants prepared medicines, preserves, and cordials, operated year-round but with shifting focus in winter. Summer's work emphasized preserving abundant fresh ingredients for future use. Winter's work turned to creating remedies for cold-weather ailments, cough syrups, warming tonics, salves for chilblains and chapped skin. The knowledge required was extensive and practical, combining herbal lore with careful observation of effects. These women served as the castle's primary healthcare providers, their skills encompassing everything from minor injuries to childbirth to palliative care for the dying. Their preparations, stored in ceramic jars, glass bottles, and wooden boxes, lined the stillroom shelves, labeled with symbols or words depending on the literacy of those responsible. The mews, where hunting birds were kept, required special winter management. These valuable animals, hawks, falcons, sometimes eagles, needed protection from the cold while maintaining the specific conditions their health required. Too much heat could damage their feathers. Too little would threaten their lives. The falconers responsible often slept in the mews during the coldest nights, their presence providing both surveillance against theft and additional warmth for their charges. Hunting with these birds continued in winter when conditions allowed, providing both recreation for the nobility and welcome fresh meat for the table. The stables transformed in winter as well. Horses were valuable animals that required protection from extreme cold. Their body heat was substantial, and a properly managed stable actually stayed relatively warm through shared animal warmth and decomposing bedding material. Grooms might sleep in the haylofts above, benefiting from the rising heat while remaining close to their charges. Horses needed more food in cold weather to maintain body temperature, another calculation in the winter resource management that occupied the castle steward's constant attention. The distinctive ammoniac smell of the stables, unpleasant in summer heat, became almost welcoming in winter, a sign of life and warmth continuing despite the frozen world outside. The garderobe, a castle's toilet, has been mentioned for its discomfort, but winter brought additional complications to waste management throughout the castle. Waste buckets and chamber pots couldn't always be emptied immediately in severe weather, leading to unpleasant accumulations. Frozen moats or cesspit surfaces sometimes prevented proper drainage, creating sanitation issues that compounded as winter progressed. Castle inhabitants understood the connection between waste and disease even without modern germ theory, leading to various adaptations. Strategic placement of waste storage, application of ash or lime to control odors and discourage flies, and strict rules about where certain types of waste could be deposited when normal systems were compromised by freezing. The very fabric of the castle changed subtly with the seasons. As mentioned, stone contracted in cold, but this wasn't merely a curiosity. It was a structural reality that castle builders anticipated. Walls were constructed with sufficient mass and engineering knowledge to accommodate these changes without catastrophic failure. However, the movement wasn't without consequences. Doors that fit perfectly in summer might bind in winter frames that had contracted slightly. Arrow loops designed for defense might narrow to unusability in the coldest conditions, requiring adjustment of defensive strategies. These minor changes reminded inhabitants that the castle itself was not immutable, but responsive to the world around it. Water management within the castle went beyond preventing freezing. Snow brought onto floors by boots and shoes would melt, in indoor warmth, creating perpetually damp conditions in entryways and main corridors. Straw would be scattered and regularly replaced in these areas to absorb moisture and provide traction on slippery stone. Some castles had rudimentary drainage channels carved into corridor floors, directing melted snow and overflow from washing to collection points or exterior drains. These simple systems required regular clearing of ice to function through winter. Months, another daily task assigned to lower servants. Physical comfort during sleep came not just from bedding, but from sleeping arrangements themselves. The bed frames of the period, for those who had them rather than pallets on the floor, were designed for winter survival. The canopy and curtains mentioned earlier weren't attached to the ceiling as in later periods, but to the bed frame itself, creating a micro-environment that could be completely enclosed. Within this space, breath and body heat created a significantly warmer atmosphere than the room outside. For the highest nobility, these canopies and curtains might be lined with additional insulating material, another layer of wool, or even fur at the extreme upper end of the wealth spectrum. The curtains would be drawn closed as soon as the occupant retired, the servant responsible making sure to tuck the edges in securely to prevent drafts from infiltrating this precious warmth. Space. Body positioning during sleep also adapted to cold realities. People frequently slept in a semi-seated position, propped up on pillows or bolsters, particularly when suffering from winter respiratory illnesses. This posture helped prevent the congestion that worsened when lying flat and kept the face, the most exposed part of the sleeping body, above the heavier, colder air that settled near the floor. Multiple people sharing a bed would arrange themselves strategically, the youngest, oldest, or most vulnerable given the middle positions where they were sheltered by other bodies, the largest or healthiest taking the outer positions where they would be exposed to more cold but could better withstand it. The cycle of day and night created its own rhythm of warming and cooling throughout the castle. By late afternoon, most interior spaces had reached their peak temperature for the day, benefiting from accumulated fire heat, body heat from maximum occupancy, and any solar gain through windows. As night fell, temperatures began dropping, again leading to a gradual migration of activities. Work requiring good light and moderate dexterity would be performed near midday. As light faded and chill increased, activities shifted toward those requiring less visual acuity and less finger dexterity. Spinning instead of detailed embroidery, whittling large pieces instead of fine carving. The physical environment, thus, dictated not just where activities happened, but when, creating a daily choreography of adaptation to changing conditions. Sensory perceptions shifted with the season. Winter brought a different soundscape, the absence of many ambient noises, present in warmer months, created a backdrop of silence against which interior sounds seemed amplified. Footsteps echoed differently on frozen ground than on summer earth. Voices carried further in cold, dry air. Even the castle itself produced different sounds. The cracking of frozen timbers, the whistle of wind through narrow openings, the drip of melting ice on warmer days. Regular inhabitants became attuned to these changes, instinctively adjusting their expectations and awareness to match the altered sensory landscape. The sense of smell changed as well. Cold air carried fewer scents, making those present more noticeable by contrast. The smell of wood smoke permeated everything, clinging to clothing, hair, and furnishings. Food odors traveled differently, sometimes seeming stronger as they contrasted with the relative olfactory blankness of the winter atmosphere. The human ability to detect smoke, a survival trait warning of fire danger, remained sharp, while more pleasant scents seemed muted. Castle inhabitants might use strong herbs and spices more liberally in winter, not just for their perceived medicinal properties, but to compensate for this sensory dampening. Touch became simultaneously more important and more limited. Bare skin was exposed as rarely as possible, meaning that most interaction with the environment happened through gloves or mittens that reduced tactile sensitivity. This necessitated adaptations in everything from eating to craft work. Foods that could be consumed with minimal utensils were preferred for everyday meals. Tools were modified with wrapped handles or redesigned to be usable with covered hands. The sensitivity of exposed skin increased through contrast. Faces and hands, when briefly uncovered, registered temperature changes more acutely because they remained covered the rest of the time. This heightened awareness of cold made even minor variations in temperature noticeable. Moving from a truly cold corridor to a merely cool chamber could feel like significant relief when the body was attuned to such subtle differences. Vision adapted to winter conditions as well. The extreme contrast between outdoor brightness, sun reflecting off snow on clear days, and indoor dimness strained eyes in ways different from summer's more moderate light transitions. Night vision became more crucial and often better, developed in those who spent their lives without artificial lighting. The ability to navigate familiar spaces in near total darkness was not just convenient, but sometimes necessary for survival, as when answering nature's call during the night, or responding to emergencies that couldn't wait for proper lighting to be arranged. The taste of winter was distinctive. Heavily salted or smoked meats, root vegetables grown sweeter with storage, bread that might be somewhat stale by modern standards, broths and pottages that concentrated flavors through long cooking. The body craved different foods in winter, particularly those high in fat and carbohydrates that provided maximum calories for maintaining body temperature. This biological wisdom manifested as preference and satisfaction rather than conscious choice. Fatty meats tasted better in winter than they had in summer. Sweet, preserved fruits seemed more appealing. The heaviness of winter bread felt more satisfying. The body guided consumption toward survival without the eater necessarily understanding the science behind these preferences. Time itself seemed to move differently. Without precise mechanical clocks, time was marked by activities, natural light, and physical needs. Winter compressed these markers. Fewer distinct activities, less variation in natural light from day to day, physical needs that focused primarily on warmth and basic sustenance rather than the varied requirements of warmer seasons. Days blurred together more readily, creating the psychological challenge of seeming endlessness that required cultural antidotes. The religious calendar with its feast days, the telling and retelling of stories that marked time's passage, the deliberate creation of special occasions to punctuate the winter monotony. Clothing wasn't just practical, but communicative during winter. The ability to stay reasonably warm while maintaining an appearance of ease indicated high status. Wealthy nobles might deliberately wear garments that displayed affluence even at some cost to practicality. Fur trim arranged to be visible rather than only where it provided maximum warmth. Fingers left partially exposed to show rings despite the discomfort. Lower status individuals focused entirely on warmth, their winter appearance guided solely by practicality. This visible distinction reinforced social hierarchy even when other status markers, like elaborate gardens or hunting, parties, were suspended for the season. The castle's water supply required constant attention. Wells within the castle walls might freeze at their surface, requiring daily breaking of ice to access the water below. Springs, if the castle was fortunate enough to have one within its walls, needed protection from freezing, usually through structures built around them that trapped enough earth heat to keep water flowing. When these primary sources were compromised by severe cold, snow would be gathered and melted, a labor-intensive process that consumed precious fuel and produced relatively small amounts of water. This water shortage affected everything from cooking to bathing to brewing, with priority always given to drinking and food preparation. Hand washing became more minimalist. Clothes washing might be postponed entirely, and bathing frequency decreased from its already limited summer schedule. Economic activities shifted with the seasons. Some specialized roles became more valuable. In winter, charcoal makers who produced fuel more efficient than raw wood, furriers who could repair or remake worn cold-weather garments, coopers whose barrels protected food stores from vermin. Other roles diminished or transformed. Agricultural workers might become temporary carpenters. Masons might turn to carving decorative stonework that could be installed in spring. Soldiers might assist with hunting when not needed for defense. This flexibility allowed the castle community to maintain necessary social and economic functions despite seasonal constraints. The concept of privacy changed with winter crowding. Spaces that might offer solitude in warmer months, when people could disperse more widely throughout the castle and its grounds, became communal by necessity when cold drove everyone toward central heat sources. This constant companionship had both positive and negative effects, strengthening some social bonds while straining others, providing security through constant monitoring while eliminating opportunities for personal reflection or confidential conversation. Those who valued privacy might rise earlier than others to capture a brief period of solitude before communal activities began, or develop the ability to create psychological privacy even in physical proximity to others. A skill still valuable in modern crowded environments. Health concerns shifted with the seasons. Winter brought respiratory infections spread more easily in crowded indoor conditions, chilblains and frostbite from cold exposure, and dietary deficiencies as fresh foods became scarce, yet it also reduced certain other health threats. Insect-borne diseases virtually disappeared, food spoilage slowed dramatically, and many parasites became dormant. Medical practices adapted accordingly, with preventive measures focusing on maintaining warmth and adequate nutrition. Treatment options were limited by modern standards but not non-existent. Herbal preparations, poultices, controlled bleeding based on humoral theory, and bone setting for injuries from falls on ice. The castle's designated healers, whether formally trained physicians for the wealthy or wise women with practical experience for common folk, adjusted their practices to the seasonal pattern of ailments. Winter brought particular challenges for specific segments of the castle population. The elderly suffered most directly from cold, their bodies less efficient at generating and retaining heat. They might be assigned sleeping places closest to heat sources and given priority for limited warm food and drink. Their expertise became more valued as outdoor activities decreased and indoor crafts and storytelling took precedence, temporarily elevating their social status. Young children faced different challenges. Their smaller bodies lost heat more rapidly, yet they needed exercise and activity for proper development. Creative solutions emerged, with designated indoor play areas, simplified physical games that could be conducted in limited space, and educational activities that burned energy while building skills. Pregnant women received special accommodation, their needs for adequate nutrition and reduced physical strain recognized as essential for producing healthy new members of the community. Religious observances took on additional significance in winter. Beyond providing calendar structure, they offered psychological comfort and community bonding during the most challenging season. Christmas wasn't yet the elaborate celebration it would become in Victorian times, but it marked an important midwinter milestone. The days had reached their shortest point and would now begin lengthening again, a promise of eventual spring. Candlemas in early February celebrated increasing light with literal illumination. More candles lit than usual, defying winter darkness both physically and symbolically. These observances weren't separate from survival. They were integral to it, maintaining hope and community cohesion when both were essential for enduring until spring. Defense considerations shifted with the seasons. While large-scale sieges were rare in winter due to the supply and movement challenges faced by attacking forces, smaller raiding parties might take advantage of frozen moats or snowdrifts that created access points normally protected by water or difficult terrain. Sentries suffered in the cold but couldn't be eliminated, requiring creative rotation schedules that balanced human endurance against security needs. Watchfires provided necessary warmth but created light that reduced night vision and potentially revealed defensive positions. These competing needs led to complicated protocols. Watchfires placed out of direct sight lines from potential approach roads, shields used to direct heat toward sentries while blocking light from potential observers, more frequent rotation of guards between exposed and sheltered positions. Winter provided opportunities amid its challenges. Marshy areas, impassable in warmer months, became traversable when frozen solid, opening trade routes temporarily unavailable during most of the year. Hunting changed character. Tracking animals through snow revealed their movements with unprecedented clarity, while frozen lakes and ponds made previously inaccessible island locations available for resource gathering. Transportation of heavy items became easier in some cases, with sleds moving more efficiently over snow than wagons over rutted roads. Castle inhabitants with knowledge of local conditions recognized and exploited these temporary advantages, gathering resources from locations that would be unreachable for most of the year. Social relationships evolved under winter conditions. The formal hierarchy remained, but practical considerations sometimes modified its expression. A lord might consult more regularly with his master of works or head forester during winter, their specialized knowledge of building maintenance or fuel management temporarily elevating their importance. A lady might include her head dairywoman in discussions normally reserved for higher-ranking household members, recognizing that proper management of reduced milk production and stored dairy products could mean the difference between adequate winter nutrition and dangerous shortages. These temporary shifts in consultation patterns acknowledge the reality that survival required practical expertise as much as traditional authority. Entertainment adapted to available resources. Games requiring little equipment, dice, simple board games using pebbles, or carved pieces on gridded surfaces, verbal games of riddles or storytelling competitions, replaced more elaborate warm weather activities. Physical games moved indoors on all but the mildest days, simplified to account for limited space and the constraints of winter clothing. Music remained important, with instruments chosen for indoor suitability. Quieter strings rather than outdoor appropriate percussion or loud wind instruments. Dancing continued despite the cold, providing both entertainment and physical warmth, or through movement. The styles shifted toward patterns that could be performed in limited space while wearing heavy clothing. Less leaping and more measured stepping, less partner separation, and more group formations that kept participants close together for shared warmth. Communication networks contracted but intensified. With less travel between communities, information traveled more slowly but was processed more thoroughly. News arriving at the castle via occasional hardy travelers would be discussed extensively, analyzed from multiple perspectives, compared with previous information, and integrated into the community's understanding of the wider world. This slower, more deliberate information processing created a different relationship with news. Less immediate, but potentially more thoughtful than our modern constant updates. Messages sent from the castle underwent similar careful consideration, with the difficulty of winter travel meaning each communication needed to maximize its value, combining multiple purposes and contingency instructions to reduce the need for clarification. Sleep itself was different in medieval winter. The biphasic pattern mentioned earlier, a first sleep of several hours, a period of wakefulness, then a second sleep until dawn, aligned with longer winter nights. During the wakeful period, people might engage in quiet reflection, contemplative, prayer, whispered conversation with bed partners, or even write if they had access to materials and light. Some scholars believe this divided sleep pattern allowed for a type of consciousness different from both ordinary wakefulness and dreaming, a meditative state particularly conducive to creative thinking and problem solving. If so, the enforcement of this pattern by winter darkness may have contributed to the cultural and intellectual development of medieval society in ways difficult to quantify but potentially significant. The emotional landscape of winter had its own geography. Fear was present. Fear of inadequate resources, fear of serious illness with limited treatment options, fear of structural fires that could leave inhabitants simultaneously homeless and exposed to lethal cold. Yet, this fear was counterbalanced by satisfactions unique to the season: the special closeness of shared survival, the appreciation of simple comforts made precious by contrast with the cold, the pride in successfully navigating another winter day using inherited knowledge and personal skill. Medieval people didn't romanticize winter hardship, but neither did they experience it as unrelieved misery. Like their modern descendants, they contained the psychological complexity to hold multiple emotional truths simultaneously, acknowledging difficulty while finding genuine satisfaction in overcoming it, recognizing danger while appreciating beauty, feeling the burden of winter while still discovering moments of joy within it. As winter progressed, subtle shifts in routine acknowledged changing conditions. By February, stored foods required more creative preparation as variety diminished, combining ingredients in new ways to combat appetite fatigue, using stronger seasonings to enhance fading flavors, employing more elaborate cooking methods to make humble ingredients more satisfying. The physical toll of winter began showing more visibly. Weight loss in all but the wealthiest, pallor from lack of sunlight, dry skin and hair from cold, dry air, and reduced bathing. Yet experience brought certainty that these conditions were temporary. Each passing week, though physically more challenging, brought the castle community closer to spring's relief. This knowledge itself was a resource, the psychological strength that comes from certainty that hardship, though real, is finite. The transition from winter to spring was neither sudden nor reliable. False springs, brief warm periods followed by returns to freezing temperatures, tested morale more severely than consistent cold. The cycle of hope and disappointment required its own coping mechanisms: cautious preparation without overcommitment, careful management of expectations, strategic use of remaining winter resources that anticipated possible extension of cold conditions while preparing for their end. The castle's leadership faced complex decisions during this period: when to allow additional consumption of carefully rationed supplies, when to begin spring planting, preparations, when to transition from winter to spring routine. These decisions relied on observation of natural indicators, meteorological folklore, and the accumulated wisdom of previous years' experiences. Throughout all these winter adaptations ran the thread of community. No single individual, regardless of rank or skill, could survive a medieval winter alone. The interdependence was absolute and acknowledged, from the lord who provided the basic shelter and organization to the lowest servant who performed essential tasks in maintaining warmth and food preparation. Winter stripped away some illusions of independence that might prevail in more abundant seasons, revealing the fundamental truth that human survival was, and remains, a cooperative endeavor. The castle was not merely a collection of individuals sharing space. It was a functioning organism with each person contributing to collective survival. This reality shaped medieval consciousness in ways that extended beyond winter, but were most clearly visible during the season of greatest challenge. The passage of a medieval winter required no heroics, no extraordinary measures, simply the patient application of accumulated human wisdom to the unchangeable reality of cold. The discomforts were real but expected. The dangers were significant but familiar. The solutions were imperfect but sufficient. Modern visitors to castle ruins, admiring their imposing architecture, rarely consider this most basic truth. These structures were not just defensive or political statements, but survival machines, designed and operated to keep their inhabitants alive through conditions that would otherwise prove fatal. Their success in this fundamental purpose, season after winter season, century after century, testifies to the effectiveness of solutions developed without modern technology, but with careful observation, practical ingenuity, and social cooperation. As you drift towards sleep once more, consider that you're experiencing something authentically medieval. Finding rest despite discomfort, security within uncertainty, connection despite hierarchy. The winter night envelops the castle in darkness and cold, yet within its walls, life continues. Altered by the season, but undefeated by it. Bodies warm beds that started cold. Breath forms small clouds that dissipate in darkness. Dreams unfold beneath layers of wool and linen and fur. And through it all, the certainty remains that spring will eventually return, as it always has, bringing warmth and growth and easier days. This certainty sustains through the darkest nights and coldest mornings, a truth as reliable as the stone walls themselves. In this slow cycle of winter survival, there is a peculiar peace, the peace of living within natural limits rather than fighting against them, of accepting what cannot be changed while ingeniously managing what can be influenced. It is a peace largely foreign to modern experience, but perhaps worth remembering. As you finally surrender to sleep, carry this understanding with you, that countless others have lain in darkness and cold before you, finding their way through winter not by conquering it, but by accepting and adapting to its reality. Their wisdom, accumulated through generations of winters endured and survived, forms an unbroken chain of human resilience stretching from those medieval nights to wherever you now rest, listening to this account of how they lived through the cold, one winter day at a time, until spring finally arrived to release them from winter's long embrace. The construction of a medieval bed itself reveals much about winter priorities. The frame typically stood higher off the ground than modern. Beds, not for grandeur but to escape the coldest air that settled near the floor. The ropes or straps that supported the mattress required regular tightening as they stretched from use. The origin of the phrase, "sleep tight." This maintenance wasn't merely for comfort, but for survival, as a sagging bed brought the sleeper closer to the cold floor. The mattress, stuffed with straw or wool or feathers depending on wealth, needed regular attention as well. Turning prevented uneven compression, and exposure to dry air reduced moisture that could become dangerously cold. Even the placement of the bed within a chamber was strategic. Away from exterior walls that radiated cold, away from windows that might leak frigid air, but not so close to a fire as to risk sparks igniting the bedding. These considerations weren't periodic upgrades but essential aspects of basic survival. The winter atmosphere within a castle created its own weather systems in miniature. Warm air rising from the great hall or kitchen created updrafts that pulled colder air from other areas, establishing consistent patterns of airflow that experienced castle dwellers learned to navigate. Certain corridors became notorious as wind tunnels where cold air accelerated. Particular corners collected pockets of warmer air that remained relatively stable. The castle's residents adapted their movement patterns to these internal weather systems, choosing certain routes over others not because they were shorter, but because they offered less exposure to cold. Guards stationed in cold locations developed a distinctive walking pattern, a continuous circuit that balanced exposure to drafts with periods in slightly more protected positions, never standing still long enough for the cold to settle deep into their bones. The most common winter footwear wasn't shoes as we conceived them, but a system of layering that began with cloth wrappings. These linen or wool strips wound around the foot and lower leg provided the primary insulation. Over these might go woolen socks for those who could afford them, and then leather shoes or boots, often with wooden soles that provided crucial separation from the frozen ground. Straw might be stuffed between layers for additional insulation. This system allowed for adjustment based on conditions. More wrappings on colder days, removal of layers if the foot began to sweat, which could be dangerous in freezing conditions. The wrappings required regular changing and drying, another daily task that consumed time but couldn't be neglected without risking frozen feet that might never properly recover. The interior landscape of the castle changed with the season. Summer saw activities spread throughout the structure and its grounds. Winter compressed this distribution dramatically. Entire sections might be effectively abandoned. Towers used only for lookouts rather than living space. North-facing rooms closed off unless absolutely needed. Upper floors of certain buildings left unused because heat never adequately reached them. This contraction served practical purposes beyond heating efficiency. It reduced the area that needed routine maintenance, concentrated limited candle and lamplight in fewer spaces, and kept the community together where they could share body heat and social connection. The unused spaces weren't forgotten, however. They required occasional inspection to ensure snow hadn't penetrated roofs or windows, that stored items weren't damaged by freezing, that structural problems weren't developing unseen. Winter transformed the castle's relationship with the surrounding landscape. Areas accessible in summer might become completely cut off by snow or frozen ground too slippery for safe travel. Conversely, bodies of water that represented boundaries or defensive features in summer might freeze solid enough to become pathways in winter. The view from castle walls displayed a transformed world. Familiar landmarks hidden under snow, trees bare of leaves revealing structures normally screened from view, smoke from distant cottages or villages providing reassurance that others survived elsewhere. This altered perspective reminded castle dwellers of both their isolation and their connection to a wider community experiencing the same challenging season, generating both caution about limited resources and commitment to maintaining the roads, and communication systems that would reconnect them when conditions allowed. Food preparation required constant adaptation as winter progressed. Early winter still offered relatively fresh storage crops and recently preserved meats. By midwinter, some items would be showing their age. Cabbages with outer leaves needing removal, onions beginning to sprout, salted meat requiring longer soaking to become palatable. Late winter demanded creative approaches to increasingly limited options, mixing the last fresh root vegetables with preserved legumes to extend both, carefully incorporating precious herbs into simpler porridges to vary the flavor, combining small amounts of increasingly precious ingredients to create the impression of greater abundance. These weren't cooking preferences, but survival strategies, maximizing nutrition and satisfaction from dwindling resources while ensuring supplies lasted until the first spring growth provided relief. The preservation of winter stores became increasingly critical as the season advanced. Initial storage arrangements focused on preventing freezing and access by rodents. As winter progressed, regular inspection became essential, identifying and removing anything beginning to spoil before it could contaminate surrounding foods, redistributing items to ensure even usage rather than creating shortages of some, while others remained abundant, making difficult decisions about rationing when necessary. Those responsible for these stores held the community's survival in their hands. Their knowledge of how long different foods remained viable, how to detect early signs of spoilage, and how much was needed to sustain the castle, population was as crucial as the strategic expertise of the military leadership. Winter clothing wasn't merely worn, it was actively managed. Wool garments absorbed body oils and needed periodic cleaning to maintain their insulating properties. Furs required brushing and exposure to cold, dry air to prevent parasites from proliferating in the warming spring. Leather needed treatment, with oils to prevent cracking as it cycled between the extreme dry cold outside and the relatively warmer, more humid interior environments. Even linen undergarments, fewer in winter than summer due to less sweating and less frequent washing, needed attention. Strategic airing on days when interior humidity was lower. Careful drying when they were washed. This constant maintenance of protective layers was as important as having the layers themselves. Neglected winter clothing lost its effectiveness at precisely the time it was needed most. The interface between castle and surrounding land remained active despite the cold. Hunting continued whenever weather permitted, focusing on different prey than in warmer seasons. Winter-thin deer moved in more predictable patterns seeking available food. Rabbits and hares were easier to track in snow. Wolves, themselves hungry, as their prey became scarcer, sometimes ventured closer to human settlements than they would in seasons of greater abundance. This created both danger and opportunity. Threat to livestock, but potential for harvesting valuable wolf fur. The castle's hunters adapted their techniques for winter conditions. Shorter expeditions to reduce exposure to cold, different. Tracking methods for snow-covered terrain, modified weapons that could be handled with gloved hands, strategies for transporting frozen game back to the castle before scavengers could claim it. The laundry routine transformed in winter. The work moved indoors, with less frequent washing of larger items like bedding that couldn't easily be dried in winter conditions. When washing did occur, it moved to the kitchen or nearby spaces where the heat of cooking fires could assist in drying. Items would be hung on lines or frames near but not too near the fire, close enough for heat to remove moisture, not so close as to risk scorching. This drying operation added welcome humidity to the dry winter air but required careful attention to prevent mold if items remained damp too long. The castle laundresses developed keen awareness of exactly how long different fabrics needed in different positions relative to heat sources, rotating items methodically to ensure even drying without wasting the precious resource of the fires. Heat. Sleep positions themselves were different than in warmer seasons. Summer might find castle residents spread across their beds, seeking to minimize skin contact that would increase warmth. Winter saw sleepers curled tightly, minimizing the surface area exposed to cold air. This instinctive positioning wasn't taught, but emerged naturally from the body's wisdom. Those who curled conserved heat more effectively and slept better, reinforcing the behavior. Multiple people sharing a bed developed understood but unspoken choreography, shifting positions simultaneously to maintain shared warmth without fully waking, unconsciously making space when someone needed to turn while quickly closing ranks to prevent cold air from infiltrating the warm space they'd created. These adaptations happened without discussion or planning, the body's ancient knowledge of survival manifesting in unconscious movements that preserved precious heat. Winter brought its own sounds beyond those already mentioned. The footsteps of people wearing wooden pattens, overshoes designed to elevate feet above the wet or frozen ground, created a distinctive rhythmic clicking on stone floors. The shaking out of frozen clothing that had been hung to dry produced sharp cracking noises as ice broke from the fabric. Iron tools striking frozen wood or stone made higher-pitched rings than the same actions in warmer conditions. Even voices changed. People speaking in the Great Hall unconsciously projected more to be heard through the layers of clothing that might muffle their words, while conversations in sleeping chambers naturally hushed to conserve energy and acknowledge the intimacy of shared warmth. The castle's winter soundscape provided constant information to those attuned to its messages, from the safety of well-frozen pond ice, which made low, resonant sounds when tested, to the warning of snow-laden branches about to drop their burdens, which creaked distinctively before releasing their loads. The brewing process adjusted to winter conditions. Fermentation slowed in colder temperatures, requiring brewers to compensate by using more starter, the residue from previous batches that contained active yeast, or finding warmer locations for brewing vessels. The resulting ale might have slightly different characteristics than summer batches, sometimes stronger as fermentation continued longer before being considered complete, sometimes with subtly different flavors as the yeast responded differently to temperature variations. These differences were noted and incorporated into the castle's understanding of seasonal rhythms rather than considered flaws or inconsistencies. Winter ale might be deliberately brewed stronger not just because fermentation behaved differently, but because the higher alcohol content provided a welcome feeling of warmth to the consumer, another adaptation to cold conditions. The sleep cycle adapted to light availability. Without artificial lighting sufficient for detailed work, most castle residents synchronized their waking hours as closely as possible with available daylight. This meant earlier bedtimes in winter, but not necessarily longer total sleep. The already mentioned pattern of first and second sleep allowed for a period of quiet wakefulness during the long night. This time held cultural significance beyond mere practicality. It was when couples might conceive children in relative privacy despite shared sleeping chambers, when confidential conversations could occur without being easily overheard by others, when personal devotions or reflection might happen without the distractions of daytime activities. This different relationship with darkness, seeing it not merely as time for unconsciousness, but as a distinct state with its own purposes, represented a fundamental difference between medieval and modern sleep patterns. Winter brought increased risk of fire even as it made fire more essential. The constant presence of open flames for heating and lighting, combined with more flammable materials like additional cloth hangings and dry rushes on floors, created constant danger. This risk was managed through strict protocols, specified times for banking fires, designated individuals responsible for checking that this was done properly, rules about placement of candles and lamps, restrictions on where certain highly flammable activities could take place. The Night Watch, while concerned with external threats, focused much of their attention on fire prevention, checking that kitchen fires were properly contained before the cooks retired, ensuring that candles in public areas were extinguished. At designated times, watching for the distinctive smell of smoldering that might indicate hidden danger. Fire was both salvation from cold and potential destruction. Managing this paradox required constant vigilance. The preparation for winter began long before the first frost. Summer and fall saw intensive activity directed toward winter survival, harvesting and preserving food, cutting and storing firewood, repairing cold weather clothing, checking and maintaining the physical structure of the castle to ensure it would provide maximum protection against winter conditions. This preparation wasn't occasional or reactive, but a central organizing principle of the castle's yearly cycle. Decisions made in spring and summer, which crops to plant, how many animals to breed versus slaughter, which repairs to prioritize, all considered the coming winter as a primary factor. This future-oriented planning, the ability to work in current comfort while fully cognizant of coming challenges, distinguished human adaptation from animal instinct. The castle community prepared for winter not just because experience told them it would come, but because they could conceptualize a future that didn't yet exist and act in the present to shape it. The knowledge required for winter survival wasn't centralized but distributed throughout the castle community. The steward understood how long food stores would last at various consumption rates. The master of the wardrobe knew which clothing items needed repair before cold weather arrived. The head woodsman could calculate how much firewood was needed, based on past winter's severity. The cook knew how to adjust recipes as certain ingredients became scarcer. This distributed expertise meant no single catastrophe. The death or incapacitation of any individual could destroy the community's ability to survive the season. Knowledge was shared through both formal apprenticeship and casual observation, ensuring its perpetuation across generations. This distribution of critical information represented a kind of community resilience that protected against both natural challenges and human limitations. Winter diseases received different treatment than the same symptoms might in warmer seasons. Respiratory ailments, common as people crowded into shared indoor spaces, were treated with steam inhalation, herbal preparations designed to reduce congestion, and carefully managed exposure to fresh air when conditions allowed. Positioning of the sick considered both their need for warmth and the community's need to prevent disease spread, a balance not always perfectly achieved. Those suffering winter illnesses typically continued some level of activity rather than maintaining complete bed rest, partly from necessity. In a society that couldn't afford idle members, but also from empirical observation that moderate movement often aided recovery from winter ailments. The medical wisdom accumulated through generations of winter survival included recognition that certain conditions improved with specific interventions, while others simply needed to run their course. a distinction that prevented wasting scarce resources on ineffective treatments. The castle's animals adapted alongside their human counterparts. Horses grew thicker winter coats, their metabolism adjusting to colder conditions by extracting more nutrition from the same amount of feed. Dogs sought out sleeping places near fire or next to humans, their instinctive behavior aligning with the warmest available options. Cats became more persistent hunters as their wild prey became scarcer, providing valuable rodent control for winter food stores. Even the castle's working birds, hawks and falcons used for hunting, underwent physical changes, their plumage becoming denser, their hunting behavior adapting to winter conditions and prey behavior. The humans responsible for these animals recognized and worked with these natural adaptations rather than working against them, allowing natural biological responses to complement human caretaking. Social rules adapted to winter necessity. Behaviors that might be considered too familiar or improper in summer, sharing close quarters without formal divisions, direct physical contact to share warmth, frank discussion of bodily functions affected by cold, became temporarily acceptable within understood boundaries. These modified social codes weren't abandonment of propriety, but practical adjustments that acknowledged reality while maintaining basic social order. The lady of the castle might sit closer to her male servants than summer etiquette would allow, but clear distinctions remained about appropriate topics of conversation and required forms of address. The lord might discuss castle maintenance directly with workers rather than through intermediaries, as efficiency became more important than maintaining formal distance. These winter adjustments provided a safety valve for rigid social structures, allowing temporary flexibility that actually reinforced the overall system by demonstrating its adaptability to changing conditions. Sleep itself became a resource to be managed. Energy expended in staying awake during the longest nights taxed the body's reserves, yet too much time in bed led to stiffness, muscle weakness, and psychological difficulties. The castle community developed patterns that balanced these concerns. Periods of shared activity punctuating longer stretches of rest, scheduled times for more energy-intensive tasks when bodies had naturally warmed through previous movement. Quieter activities saved for times when deep cold made conservation of energy more important. Those responsible for others, parents with children, masters with servants, caretakers with the elderly or ill, made conscious decisions about when to encourage activity versus when to permit extended rest, recognizing that both were necessary for winter survival and that the proper balance shifted with changing conditions both outside and inside the castle walls. Winter created its own mental landscape. With fewer external distractions and more time for reflection, thought patterns changed. Memory became more important, recalling exactly how previous winters had progressed, what solutions had worked for specific problems, when signs of spring typically began appearing. Imagination served practical purposes, envisioning how a limited resource might serve multiple functions, planning multi-step processes that would maximize use of available heat or light, considering contingencies if conditions worsened beyond. Expectations. This mental adaptation wasn't distraction from reality, but engagement with it at a deeper level, using the mind's capabilities to supplement physical resources. Stories told during long winter evenings weren't merely entertainment, but mental exercise, keeping cognitive functions sharp during a season when physical activity was more limited. The vertical experience of the castle changed with winter. Heat. Rising meant upper floors often felt warmer than ground levels despite being further from heat sources and closer to cold roofs. This temperature inversion influenced how spaces were used. Activities requiring manual dexterity might move upward where fingers would remain more flexible, while tasks requiring physical exertion moved downward where cooler conditions prevented overheating during heavy work. The experience of moving through the castle's levels became a journey through microclimates, each requiring slight adjustments in clothing, expectations, and behavior. Regular inhabitants made these adjustments, unconsciously, their bodies responding to familiar conditions with automatic adaptations. Visitors, however, often struggled with these transitions, their discomfort marking them as outsiders even more clearly than differences in speech or dress. The castle's natural light changed quality as well as duration. Winter sunlight, when it appeared, entered at lower angles than summer light, penetrating deeper into rooms from south-facing windows but leaving north-facing chambers in perpetual shadow. This changing light affected activities. Embroidery or document reading might relocate to follow optimal lighting conditions, or rotate through different spaces as the short day progressed. The quality of winter light itself differed, often clearer and sharper when present due to lower humidity and particulates in the air, but frequently diffused by cloud cover. These light variations influenced mood as well as activity. The psychological lift of clear winter sunshine was recognized and celebrated, with tasks being adjusted to take advantage of its brief appearance, while strategies for maintaining morale during extended cloudy periods became part of the community's emotional management. Food taste changed with winter consumption patterns. The body, requiring more calories for warmth, gravitated toward higher fat options that might seem unappealingly heavy in summer. Sweet flavors became more attractive as the body sought energy-dense nutrition. Salt became more noticeable and necessary as preserved foods dominated the diet. These changing preferences weren't merely psychological, but physiological. The body's wisdom guiding consumption toward what it needed most. The castle's cooks understood these seasonal taste shifts and worked with them rather than against them, adjusting seasonings and preparations to satisfy changing preferences while extending increasingly limited resources. What might taste balanced in October would seem bland by January. What might be too rich in summer became satisfying in February. These taste adaptations happened without conscious decision, the body's ancient survival mechanisms guiding preferences toward maximum caloric efficiency. Water itself became a different substance. Its frozen state, ice, served functions beyond the obvious challenge to liquid water access. Ice harvested from clean sources could be stored in straw-insulated chambers, providing cooling for food preservation even after winter ended. Ice could preserve fresh-caught fish when spring fishing began, but temperatures still allowed freezing. Clean snow, gathered carefully, could be used to cool drinks for the wealthy or to treat certain injuries and inflammations. The castle's relationship with frozen water balanced the inconvenience of its solid state against these practical uses, recognizing that temporarily frozen water wasn't merely an obstacle, but a resource with its own possibilities. This adaptable perspective, seeing challenge and opportunity simultaneously, characterized the medieval approach to winter survival in all its aspects. The concept of comfort itself differed from modern expectations. Physical comfort wasn't anticipated as a constant state, but as an occasional relief. The relative warmth near a fire after hours in the cold, the satisfaction of a hot meal after working in freezing conditions, the momentary luxury of clean, dry clothing after wearing damp garments by necessity. This different relationship with comfort wasn't deprivation by medieval standards, but normal human experience. The background of mild discomfort making moments of relief more noticeable and appreciated. The castle residents didn't expect to be consistently comfortable during winter. They expected to manage discomfort effectively enough to survive while appreciating the genuine pleasure of its periodic absence. This calibration of expectations itself reduced suffering. The absence of frustration from unmet expectations of constant comfort allowed genuine appreciation of comfort when it occurred. Winter reinforced certain community values through necessity. Wastefulness, always discouraged, became openly condemned as potentially threatening survival. Hoarding beyond fair share received similar social sanction as undermining the community's collective resilience. Generosity, within reason, gained additional praise as directly contributing to group welfare. These values weren't abstract principles but practical necessities when resources were limited and mutual support essential for survival. The castle's social structure, while hierarchical, incorporated these community values through noblesse, oblige, the obligation of the privileged to care for those beneath them, particularly in times of scarcity. This obligation wasn't merely ethical, but practical. The lord's prosperity depended ultimately on the survival and productivity of those who served him. Winter made these interdependencies more visible and immediate than they might appear in seasons of greater abundance. Certain individuals took on heightened importance during winter months. The castle's woodkeeper, responsible for monitoring and distributing firewood, became a central figure whose decisions directly affected everyone's comfort and survival. The baker, whose ovens produced not just bread but heat that warmed surrounding spaces, gained additional status. The miller, if the castle was fortunate enough to have a watermill that continued operating despite ice, became essential as grain processing couldn't be postponed until spring without risking hunger. These seasonal shifts in relative importance didn't formally alter the social hierarchy but created practical recognition of different contributions. A flexibility that helped the community adapt to changing needs without dismantling the overall social structure that provided stability through all seasons. The experience of time passing manifested differently in winter. Without the external indicators of plant growth and agricultural cycles that marked time passing in warmer months, internal rhythms gained prominence. The gradual depletion of stored resources, the slowly changing angles of available sunlight, the progression of religious observances on the calendar. These markers required more conscious attention than the obvious external changes of growing seasons. Individuals responsible for tracking and communicating these progressions. The castle steward monitoring supplies, the chaplain or priest announcing approaching holy days, the chronicler marking days and weeks in written records, served as the community's timekeepers, helping maintain temporal orientation during months when external cues diminished. This awareness of progression, however measured, provided psychological reassurance that winter, though seeming eternal during its depths, was in fact passing toward inevitable spring. The night sky took on greater significance in winter, with darkness dominating the daily cycle. The stars and moon provided both practical illumination and a psychological connection to the wider universe. Those who needed to move about after dark, guards making their rounds, servants responding to nighttime requirements, individuals answering nature's call, relied on moonlight when available, their activities expanding or contracting with lunar phases. The visible constellations, shifting with the season, provided another marker of winter's progression. Certain stars or groupings appearing above the horizon signaled the approaching season's change as reliably as any calendar. This celestial timekeeping connected castle dwellers to a cosmic cycle larger than immediate concerns, positioning winter hardship within a greater pattern that continued regardless of human comfort or struggle. The language of winter contained its own specialized vocabulary. Words for specific types of snow or ice that might not be used for months became common in daily conversation. Terms describing whether snow would bear weight or give way, whether ice was newly formed or solid enough for crossing, whether falling snow would accumulate or melt on contact. Phrases related to fire management entered regular speech: banking coals, drawing a fire, feeding flames. Words related to winter diseases and their remedies became more frequent, as did terms for specific winter activities and tools. This seasonal shift in language reflected the central role winter played in consciousness, so significant that it required its own descriptive capacity, so present that it infiltrated daily speech patterns. The specialized winter vocabulary represented the community's accumulated knowledge of the season encoded in language, passed from generation to generation through the words used to describe shared experience. Winter dreams took on their own character, influenced by physical conditions, changing light exposure, and altered daily activities. Sleeping in colder conditions generally produced shorter sleep cycles with more frequent waking, resulting in more dreams being remembered as waking occurred during or shortly after REM periods. The content of dreams often reflected winter preoccupations, concerns about resources, symbolic representations of cold and warmth, scenarios involving light and darkness. Some believed these winter dreams held special significance, providing insights or warnings more potent than dreams during other seasons. Whether supernatural or simply the mind processing winter's unique challenges, these dreams became part of the community's experience of the season, discussed around morning fires, interpreted according to folk tradition, sometimes influencing daily decisions if they seemed particularly significant or prophetic. Personal appearance changed with winter pragmatism. Hairstyles simplified to accommodate head coverings worn almost constantly. Beards became more common among men as they provided natural facial insulation and reduced the need for cold water washing. Skincare adapted to winter conditions. Oils replacing water-based cleansing. Protection from wind taking precedence over cosmetic concerns. Chapped hands accepted as inevitable but treated with rendered animal fat mixed with beeswax or herbs when available. Even posture changed. People moving with shoulders slightly hunched to conserve body heat, necks withdrawn into collars or scarves, steps shorter and more careful on potentially icy surfaces. These physical adaptations happened automatically as the body responded to conditions, becoming so habitual during winter months that their disappearance with spring warmth felt temporarily strange, the body needing to relearn its warm weather relationships with space and movement. The sensory experience of touch transformed not just through reduced exposure but through changing sensitivity. Hands repeatedly exposed to cold became less immediately responsive to temperature variation but more sensitive to texture, able to distinguish subtle differences in fabric or material quality even through gloves, important when visual assessment was limited by poor light. The face, usually the only skin directly exposed to air, developed heightened sensitivity to wind direction and moisture content, providing environmental information without conscious analysis. Indoor sensitivity shifted as well. Fingers better at detecting drafts, skin more aware of radiant heat sources, the body continuously mapping its surroundings through sensations of relative warmth and cold. This environmental awareness through physical sensation supplemented visual and auditory information, creating a composite understanding of surroundings crucial for navigation and decision-making in challenging conditions. Winter created its own beauty, appreciated even amid its challenges. The transformation of familiar landscapes under snow, ice formations catching light in crystalline patterns, frost creating delicate artwork on window parchment. These visual elements provided aesthetic experiences unique to the season. While not romanticized to the extent found in later artistic traditions, this beauty was nonetheless noticed and valued, providing momentary transcendence of physical discomfort through visual pleasure. The castle's inhabitants might pause briefly on ramparts to observe a particularly striking sunrise over snow-covered fields, or comment on the perfect symmetry of ice crystals formed on a water bucket, these moments of appreciation integrating aesthetic awareness with practical survival rather than separating them into distinct categories of experience. The cycle of winter maintenance fell into established rhythms. Certain tasks needed daily attention, replenishing firewood supplies and interior storage from outdoor stacks, clearing critical pathways of fresh snow, checking water sources for access, ensuring essential tools hadn't been damaged by freezing conditions overnight. Other maintenance occurred weekly, more thorough clearing of larger areas, rotation of food stores to ensure even usage, laundering of essential items, inspection of areas not in daily use. Monthly attention went to aspects that changed more slowly, adjustment of food rationing if needed, redistribution of resources based on updated projections, maintenance of equipment that would be essential for spring activities. These nested cycles of attention ensured nothing critical was overlooked while not wasting energy on unnecessarily frequent checks of stable conditions. Another balance between vigilance and efficiency characteristic of winter survival strategies. The boundaries between human and animal spaces became more permeable. Certain domestic animals moved indoors. Chickens might be relocated to more sheltered coops attached to human structures. Smaller livestock sometimes brought into ground floor, spaces normally not shared with humans. This proximity created challenges. Additional cleaning requirements, management of animal waste, prevention of damage to stored items. But these were accepted as necessary compromises. The shared body heat benefited humans and animals alike, while keeping valuable livestock alive through harsh conditions protected essential resources for spring rebuilding. The castle inhabitants distinguished between productive animals worth this accommodation and vermin to be excluded regardless of season. A practical calculus based on each creature's contribution to or detraction from human survival. Sleep surfaces themselves evolved with winter conditions. Summer might see castle residents sleeping on stuffed mattresses placed directly on bed frames, perhaps with a single light covering. Winter transformed these arrangements with layers of insulation both below and above the sleeper. Under the mattress might go additional straw, woolen blankets too worn for other use, or even hides to provide separation from the cold frame. Above, layers accumulated according to availability and need. First linen, sheets, then woolen blankets, then coverlets of heavier material, perhaps topped with furs or additional cloaks if available. Each layer trapped air between it and the next, creating multiple insulating pockets more effective than a single thick covering would be. The weight of these coverings was substantial, leading to the characteristic constrained sleep positioning mentioned earlier. Movement limited not just by preference for heat conservation, but by the physical difficulty of shifting position under such weight. The management of daily energy expenditure became an unconscious calculus. Certain essential tasks couldn't be postponed regardless of conditions. Defense, basic food preparation, minimum maintenance of fire and shelter. Others could be adjusted based on day-to-day variations in weather, available light, and human endurance. Castle leadership made these determinations constantly, balancing immediate needs against conservation of human energy. A task that might be completed in one day during warmer seasons might be spread across several winter days, not from laziness but from recognition that forcing completion through extended cold exposure might result in illness that would reduce overall productivity more than the delay. This fluid adjustment acknowledged human physiological limits as realities to be managed rather than weaknesses to be overcome through willpower alone. A perspective both more humane and more practically effective than rigid insistence on consistent productivity regardless of conditions. Winter sleep itself held a different quality. Cold-adapted sleep tended toward lighter stages rather than deep unconsciousness, the body maintaining higher alertness to respond to changing temperature or other potential threats. Dreams seemed more vivid and more frequently remembered due to this lighter sleep and more frequent waking. The winter sleep experience wasn't merely shorter but fundamentally different in nature. A vigilant rest rather than complete surrender to unconsciousness. The body maintained just enough awareness to adjust position for maximum warmth, to respond to truly dangerous drops in temperature, to register unusual sounds that might indicate threats to safety. This adaptive sleep pattern, while providing less complete respite than might be ideal, represented another survival mechanism, the body protecting itself even in its most vulnerable state. The psychological experience of winter included complex emotional responses. Mild seasonal depression was recognized, though not named as such. The winter melancholy considered a normal response to reduced light and limited activity, rather than an illness requiring intervention. Preventive measures were built into winter routines, social gatherings that interrupted isolation, physical activity incorporated into necessary tasks, exposure to available sunlight whenever possible, engagement with creative or intellectual pursuits that provided mental stimulation. These weren't formalized mental health protocols, but intuitive adaptations passed through generations. Their effectiveness demonstrated through practical experience rather than theoretical understanding. The community recognized that winter challenges were emotional as well as physical, and developed countermeasures that addressed both dimensions simultaneously through integrated daily practices. The very definition of cleanliness shifted with seasonal reality. Summer standards of regular washing, frequent linen changes, and daily grooming adapted to winter limitations on water access and heightened risks of cold exposure. Clean hands and faces remained important, particularly before food preparation or consumption, but full-body washing became less frequent. Clean linen against the skin maintained importance, but outer garments might be brushed rather than washed, aired rather than fully cleaned. These adjusted standards weren't experienced as deprivation, but as practical adaptation. The community's collective understanding of clean enough shifting to accommodate winter reality while maintaining basics, hygiene necessary for health. This flexibility in standards, the ability to adjust expectations to circumstances without abandoning core principles, characterized medieval winter adaptation across many domains of daily life. The winter personality of the castle itself emerged through months of cold. Its structural characteristics became more apparent as they influenced daily life more directly. Which rooms retained heat better? Which corridors created problematic drafts? Which staircases became treacherous when moisture froze on stone treads? The building revealed itself as a complex system with both supportive and challenging features. Its winter personality as distinct from its summer character as that of any human inhabitant. Those who knew the castle well developed relationship-like knowledge of its quirks and tendencies, which doors needed extra force when swollen with moisture, which window shutters rattled in particular wind directions, which floor sections creaked warnings of ice formation underneath. This intimate knowledge of physical space represented another survival tool, allowing inhabitants to work with rather than against the structure's inherent characteristics. The experience of physical isolation intensified during winter's worst periods. Days, or sometimes weeks, might pass when no one entered or left the castle due to impassable conditions, creating temporary self-containment more complete than at any other time. This isolation required psychological adaptation, acceptance of limited social contact beyond the immediate community, postponement of news exchange with the wider world, patience with the unchanging company of the same people in close quarters. Yet this isolation also generated closer bonds within the contained group, enhanced appreciation for previously overlooked qualities in familiar companions, and development of more nuanced social relationships as daily proximity revealed aspects of personality that might remain hidden in more expansive conditions. Winter's enforced intimacy created challenges, but also deepened community bonds that would sustain collective effort through the remainder of the cold season and beyond. In this slow cycle of winter survival, we find a peculiar peace. The peace of living within natural limits rather than fighting against them, of accepting what cannot be changed while ingeniously managing what can be influenced. It is a peace largely foreign to modern experience, but perhaps worth remembering. As you finally surrender to sleep, carry this understanding with you, that countless others have lain in darkness and cold before you, finding their way through winter not by conquering it, but by accepting and adapting to its reality. Their wisdom, accumulated through generations of winters endured and survived, forms an unbroken chain of human resilience stretching from those medieval nights to wherever you now rest, listening to this account of how they lived through the cold, one winter day at a time, until spring finally arrived to release them from winter's long embrace.